Thank you, Speaker. I rise today to speak on Bill 184. I've been listening intently to the debate today, and I thought before digging into the details of the bill, it would be appropriate to contextualize the challenges facing renters right now. Prior to the pandemic, rental rates were soaring. For example, in Ottawa, over the past 5 years, rental rates have risen by 25%, 8.4% in the last year alone. A study by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives found that a minimum wage earner had to work 79 hours per week to afford the average one-bedroom apartment in Toronto. According to Feed Ontario, 90% of food bank users are rental or social housing tenants that spend more than 70% of their income on rent. Prior to COVID, a growing number of people could not afford their rent if they could even find a place to rent. Speaker, 0% of the market rental housing is affordable for a full-time minimum wage worker in Barrie, Guelph, Hamilton, Kitchener, Peterborough, Ottawa, and Thunder Bay. Speaker, this situation is not sustainable, and that's why we need a housing bill that both increases supply and affordability, that mandates inclusionary zoning in all new developments, that makes more land available for co-op housing, that increases the supply of social and supportive housing. None of this is in Bill 184. Instead, Bill 184 makes it easier for tenants to be evicted. Think about that. It's exactly the wrong time for that to be taking place. And what troubles me most in this bill is the provisions that seek to bypass the Landlord and Tenant Board. I think it's dangerous to bring things out of the scope of this regulated setting and create a wild west of private agreements that then become the basis for evictions. I worry about landlords pressuring tenants into signing onto repayment agreements they simply do not understand, or they don't have the resources to deal with without a proper hearing at the board. Community Legal Services Ontario has warned of this, and I quote, "Individuals who are at particular risk of signing payment agreements that will result in their evictions are tenants who struggle with literacy, language, and other communications barriers. Without the requirement that parties attend the Landlord and Tenant Board before an eviction order can be enforced, there will be no way to ensure these individuals do not fall through the cracks." End quote. Speaker, instead of creating alternative dispute resolution mechanisms in which landlords hold most of the cards, why not strengthen the existing process to be fair and more effective? Speaker, I'm also worried about provisions that limit issues that can be brought up at eviction hearings. For instance, the right of tenants to bring up chronic repair and maintenance issues is restricted in Bill 184 if they don't give advance written notice. I don't see the point of this loophole unless it's to give landlords a free pass to not hold up their end of the deal to provide safe and decent housing. Why would the government bring forward a bill making it easier to evict tenants while we're in a pandemic? There are currently about 50,000 arrears applications awaiting processing when the current eviction moratorium is lifted. If this bill passes, a larger number of vulnerable people who have lost their jobs, who are on disability or social assistance, who have received no provincial relief payments will face eviction. To add housing instability onto the employment instability that so many people are facing is simply irresponsible. A number of law associations have sent an open letter to all of us, and it says, and I quote, "This bill is out of touch with the challenges faced by tenants, especially as the pandemic crisis has deepened the vulnerabilities of low-income Ontarians." End quote. Speaker, health experts are warning of a second wave, and I pray that we don't have to respond with another lockdown. But if we do, how are people going to shelter in place if they don't have a home to shelter in? At the same time, Speaker, I know there are a number of landlords struggling out there as well. They too have to pay the bills. But instead of making it easier to evict tenants, why doesn't the government deliver a rent relief fund that works for tenants and landlords? The Federation of Rental Housing Providers came to the committee looking at economic recovery and put forward ideas for such a plan that can work. This is how we can find the kind of balance that so many members opposite have talked about during this debate. Those are the kinds of innovative housing-first solutions we need to search out. And so, Speaker, I urge the members opposite, just withdraw Bill 184. Let's debate this after the pandemic. Right now, the priority should be keeping people in their homes. It is far less expensive to house people than it is to deal with people who are unhoused. Thank you, Speaker.
Questions? The member for Eglinton Lawrence.
Speaker, and I listened to my friend opposite intently. The member said that he was reading from something a stakeholder said, that there is no requirement to attend a long-term the Landlord and Tenant Board before an eviction order can be enforced. That is patently false, and the minister spoke here and went through all of the steps in eviction process. The eviction notice is just the first one. The second one is an application. Then there's the hearing, which is delivered. And the notice, by the way, comes with information which tells people what their rights are, and that doesn't mean that they will be evicted if they get this notice. Then there's the order, and then there's the enforcement, which can only be done by a sheriff. So I'd ask the member opposite why he seems to have misconstrued this provision and thought that you can just go directly to...
I'm going to ask the member from Eglinton Lawrence to withdraw her unparliamentary language.
Why you think you can just be evicted based on a notice.
Member for Guelph.
Thanks. I appreciate the member's question. So the bill proposes alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. It proposes agreements that can be signed outside of the context of the landlord-tenant board process. And numerous legal experts, particularly those who work with the most vulnerable and the lowest income, have raised serious concerns about tenants unknowingly signing on to provisions that they will be unable to meet and therefore are the grounds for eviction notices. Speaker, I just think that's short-sighted and irresponsible, and a much better and fair approach would be more appropriate.
Questions? The member for Toronto St. Paul's.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The member from Eglinton Lawrence said a few moments ago, it's just an eviction notice. I mean, it's just one eviction notice. So I'm wondering to the member from Guelph, and thank you for your presentation, do you think this government understands the mental distress, the trauma, the anxiety, the depression, frankly, because I've got the medical notes here from some of my constituents in St. Paul's, that even that one eviction notice brings onto a person's psyche during a pandemic? Thank you.
The member for Guelph.
I appreciate the member's question, and I would guess, and I'm assuming this is for all members in the House, but I would say probably the most challenging and heartbreaking stories that come into my office are usually people facing an eviction notice. It's one of the biggest challenges I face. So you combine the weakening of tenant rights with the cuts to legal aid, because oftentimes these folks are desperate and I'm sending them down the street, and my office is about a block away from the legal aid office. I'm oftentimes sending them down the street to get some legal help to deal with the complexities that are part of the process. And so now with cuts to legal aid combined with reducing tenant rights are creating huge anxieties that are affecting people's mental health, especially at a time when we're being told to stay at home as much as possible.
Questions? The member for Oakville.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for your interesting information you provided. My question, I know you talked a little bit about balance, and that's something that we on the government side have been very focused on. I know the official opposition is skewed extremely one way. I didn't hear any conversation about landlords that are going through a difficult time right now. I heard about tenants, and there are tenants. There are tenants, and we empathize with them, and that's why we're putting this bill through. So my question is, it's about information and about advance notice requirements, which are proposed in this bill and are in place in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, that allows landlords to prepare for hearings just like tenants do. So can you explain why you think landlords don't deserve equal rights to know what is going to be discussed at hearings? Or perhaps you do, and maybe you can explain that too. Thank you.
Member for Guelph.
Yeah, I appreciate the member opposite question. I'm going to answer it in two parts. So first of all, I just want to say a number of legal associations, I think, reached out to every member. I'm assuming we all received their open letter. And I just want to quote from their letter. The bill restricts tenants' rights to bring forward repair maintenance issues in rent arrear cases, encouraging landlords to keep their units in a state of disrepair. So I would argue that that's not a balanced provision. If you want to talk about balance, we're on the committee for economic recovery. The rental housing providers of Ontario came to the committee, and they actually, I thought, had a pretty balanced proposal. And I think we're supposed to be there to listen and propose solutions. So they said, you know what? Any case where there's a tenant who cannot pay their rent because of a COVID pandemic-related issue, why not provide a rent payment to their landlord so the landlord remains whole and the tenant is not evicted?
Thank you.
That's a balanced approach.
Question. The member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I heard the members opposite, member of this government, talk about, why haven't we heard anything about landlords? Well, why didn't this government provide the support that we had asked in the sense of rent subsidy right at the beginning of this pandemic, when we knew that people who were not able to pay their rent, all of these people are going to be evicted, especially after this bill is passed and the eviction moratorium is lifted. These people, there's going to be a tsunami of eviction. And I've heard so many of my colleagues pleaded in this House to explain what's going to happen. And it just kind of falls into deaf ears because, truly speaking, there is so much ignorance that is found on the other side. And I am appalled, Madam Speaker, to see that the lack of compassion in this House. So my question to the member from Guelph, who had a fantastic...
Please. Stop the clock, please. I'm going to ask the member for Scarborough Southwest to withdraw her unparliamentary language.
I withdraw.
Thank you. Continue.
My question to the member from Guelph is, do you think providing a rent subsidy would have helped all these tenants? Thank you very much.
The member for Guelph.
I appreciate the question, and I'm not even going to give you my opinion. I'm going to give you the opinion of the rental housing providers of Ontario, which represent landlords, frankly. So we're not even talking about a tenant advocacy organization. They came to the committee studying economic recovery and said, and they didn't go as far as the official opposition has proposed, which is a rent relief program sort of across the board. But they did come forward with, I think, a very balanced program that said, if you're a tenant that cannot pay your rent because of the pandemic, you lost your job, you know, who knows what happened, you have to stay home because you got to care for your children, or you have a sick relative or whatever, that if we had a rent relief fund targeted to those people in need, that would benefit landlords. They would receive the money and be able to pay their bills, and it would benefit those tenants. We don't evict them, because I can tell you study after study says that it is more expensive to deal with people who are homeless than it is to house people.
Question, the member for Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, as you know, when our government was elected, we inherited a housing crisis in this province where the vacancy rate just in 2018 alone was 1.8%. And as the member knows, and he mentioned in his remarks, the supply and demand issue and how he would like to increase the supply and demand. Well, obviously that high vacancy rate is a big contingent of that issue, and why there needs to be more supply and built housing and renting, so that vacancy rate can really, there could be more vacancies and more people have access to rental units. So, my question to the member is, if, supply and demand is so important, affordable housing, attainable housing, and of course, if he acknowledges the vacancy rate, which does need to be improved, why did he not support the More Homes, More Choice Act?
Member for Guelph.
Yeah, thank you, Speaker. I appreciate the question, and I have always said, Speaker, that we need to increase the supply of housing, but we can do it. We can do it without making it easier to pave over the places we love. Our farmland, green space, wetlands, natural habitat areas. There are plenty of unused land that's already been assigned for development in the White Belt. So why don't we develop that? There are huge opportunities for housing in the middle in many neighborhoods, so we don't have to choose between single-family sprawl, which seems to be what the government likes, or huge condos. Why not build in the middle? And while we're at it, and I appreciate the fact that the government has talked about inclusionary zoning in transit hubs, but let's bring in inclusionary zoning for any development. Any development should have inclusionary zoning, so we mandate affordability, so we ensure that the supply is affordable for people.
Thank you. We don't have time for another question. Further debate? Further debate?